Hello my dear friends, how is it going? I hope I find you all in good health and safe and sound. I'm Víkingr and today I'm going to talk about the term Viking and the use of this term in certain contexts, often wrongly used even by historians as a designation of an ethnic group, and also to explain its implications as a profession or activity. So basically trying to create here a quick and short approach to help understand this terminology and its uses, both right and wrong, in various contexts regarding Scandinavian historiography. In fact, in both written and archaeological sources, the term Viking was never used to designate a people, much less in the ethnic sense, but rather used as a specific activity, which cannot be said to have been a type of profession, but more in the sense of occupation or activity generally linked to maritime contexts. As I've said many times in other videos, not all Scandinavians were Vikings, but many Vikings were Scandinavians. And pay attention to the last part of what I've just said. Many Vikings were Scandinavians. However, not all Vikings were Scandinavians. It's like studying the history of mountaineering, as an example. And if we focus on the particular period, so-called Golden Age of Alpinism, we cannot say that all alpinists were British. Surely, many alpinists were British in that period, but several other non-British persons were alpinists as well. So, with no more delay, let's start our today's video, my dear friends. Please. When we use the term Viking, it is usually something that is immediately associated with the Nordic peoples, mostly Scandinavians, as if it were a term that designates a concise ethnic group. However, Viking, in terms of the scientific study of the history of human societies, is actually a focus on the history of Scandinavia and Iceland during the end of the Iron Age and the beginning of the medieval period in Northern Europe. When there is once again the intention and intensification of the northern peoples to turn to the sea and form a culture of plunder, pillaging, and also exploration and exploitation as a means of survival due to various political, economic, military, and climatic factors that forced the Scandinavians to once again have to turn to the sea or seafaring activities as a way of subsistence and survival, not directly linked to fishing activities, but rather obtaining material goods through looting, as well as the exploitation and colonization of land for agriculture and livestock. Or in other words, subsistence through the exploitation of resources. The use of the term Viking is sometimes quite trivialized and used without any criteria whatsoever, but more often it is used within contemporary and post-Romantic parameters that never existed in the societies of the time in which the Vikings existed and were part of. In this sense, the term Viking is often used to refer to a people from a specific period that lasted just a little under 300 years of the whole of Scandinavian history, as if it were a term that gives an ethnic identity, when in fact the term Viking denotes a cultural identity of which various different ethnic groups could be part of and engage in that activity. The use of the term Viking to designate an ethnic group was mistakenly used during the politically motivated Romantic movements throughout the 19th century all across Europe, until our days actually, to label a Scandinavian national identity. The same way some other European countries also picked up on certain historical periods that took place in the geographic locations those modern countries occupied during contemporary times, trying to find a past pre-Christian and often pre-Roman cultural identity that demonstrates an idea of identity union and an idea of nation, thus using certain peoples as the ancestral basis of ethnic cultural identity of a modern country. However, this was not done for Scandinavia, as there was no focus on an ethnic entity or group, but rather on an occupation, Viking, that was wrongly understood as an ethnic group. Therefore, the term Viking wrongly took on an ethnic connotation linked to the Scandinavian peoples of the period before Scandinavia's conversion to Christianity. And because of this, we often find in historical, archaeological, and even anthropological studies erroneous references such as Viking civilization, Viking society, Viking mythology, Viking religion, Viking gods, and so on and so forth. If we only focus on the period when there was a greater intensification of this activity, being Viking, then we should at least refer to these societies as Old Norse, since we are specifically dealing with a pre-Christian period of Scandinavia at the end of the Scandinavian Iron Age. Or, at the very least, since the colonization of Iceland was a very important event in the change of Scandinavian mentalities and customs, and even a change in their belief systems, we should then refer to these peoples mainly from southern Scandinavia and the settlers and colonizers of Iceland as non-Finno-Ugric Nordic peoples, to be even more specific. Because to be a Viking or engage in that activity, people did not have to be exclusively Nordic or even just Scandinavian, as we know that several peoples were Vikings in this period, including Finno-Ugric peoples like Finns and Estonians and other Baltic peoples. And as this activity spread throughout medieval Europe, many other peoples became Vikings. There's even a good example, which were the Portuguese Vikings, which I'm not going to explore here today. It stays for another time. But we know that since the 9th century of the Common Era, several Nordic Vikings engaged on a series of activities throughout the Iberian Peninsula, not all of them linked to a military character or engaging in conflict. And this coincides with the period of the formation of the Iberian medieval kingdoms and countries, post-Muslim occupation of the former first medieval Germanic territorial kingdoms, and with the rise of Christianity and Scandinavians eventually being converted to the new faith, there's literally Scandinavian Christian Vikings helping the Portuguese to retake the territories from Muslims. There's actually the very interesting account of King Sigurd I of Norway, who participated in the First Crusade. And on his way, he engaged on several skirmishes and a series of assaults towards Muslims in the Iberian Atlantic, helping the Portuguese Christians, which resulted in a series of Portuguese Christians becoming Vikings and helping in the process. But this is something for another time. But just so you have an idea of what is being illustrated here concerning the term Viking. The use of the term Viking to designate an ethnic group starts to be used mostly in a scientific background in the British historiographical literature, which began to use the term to refer to peoples of the north, giving a wrong understanding that Viking was the term for a people and not an occupation. The term Viking was loosely applied after the 60s and the 70s of the 20th century as a reference to medieval Norsemen, perhaps in an attempt on the part of the British historians to be more specific when speaking only of Scandinavians, because earlier French authors and historians such as Georges Duby and Jacques Le Goff, the great historians of renown who intensively explored medieval European history, who often used the term Norman and Normans to refer to peoples of the north of the medieval European period. This has given rise, even today, to many confusions, as the term Norman applied here derives from the ethnic designation of man of the north. So it is a more generalized term. However, it was not always used in a clear way and without demonstrating the differentiation between inhabitants of the Duchy of Normandy and the travelers, traders, explorers, and pirates from Scandinavian medieval kingdoms and other northern kingdoms. So, perhaps for this very reason, British historians after the 60s and 70s referred to or preferred to use the term Viking instead of Norman to specifically designate peoples of Scandinavia, avoiding the use of the term Norman, which had become a little bit confusing. But be that as it may, the term Viking applied here to designate medieval Scandinavian peoples also did not help at all and in turn created another kind of confusion, regarding the misunderstanding that Viking was an ethnicity. Actually, in the 50s, some authors and historians have employed the terms Scandinavians or Northmen with an ethnic connotation, and here much more precise and accurate in relation to Old Norse people, when there's a lack of a better term, obviously. One of these authors was Edward Oswald Gabriel Turville Patre, the English philologist who specialized in Old Norse studies. I think that anyone who studies or at least has an interest in medieval Scandinavian history has certainly come across one or another of Edward Turville Patre's works. Be that as it may, in the vast majority of sources of modern historiography and archaeology of the first half of the 20th century, the terms Scandinavians and Northmen did not survive much and were progressively replaced by the term Viking. Thus, the term Viking was wrongly used within a contemporary and general concept of ethnicity. So let's try to understand what the term Viking really means and why it's not a good term to designate an ethnicity. According to the sources in relation to the term Viking and how it was used and understood by the mentalities of the time, in the term Víkingr, we can see that it could derive from the Old Norse term vik, which means bay, inlet, or port, or harbor. It may also derive from the Old Norse word vig, for battle. There is also the possibility, that it derives from the Latin vicus and the Anglo-Saxon hic, meaning city and camp. And finally, a more specific hypothesis coming from the word Viken, from the dialect of the island of Rune, Rune Sala, the seal island in the Gulf of Riga, the bay of the Baltic Sea, and this word means seal hunters. It has already been said by other authors that the term Víkingr may have originated from the term Viken from the Oslo fjord region, so an inhabitant of this place would be called Víkingr, thus being a regional term not linked to ethnicity or an activity, but rather the term to designate the inhabitants of this part of Norway. The problem here is that this idea is not correct because the sources are quite specific actually, and in fact the inhabitants of this area were designated by the terms Vikverjar or Vestfaldingi and not Víkingr. So we can eliminate this last hypothesis and it is one fewer nuisance to deal with. So let's start with the earlier sources and progressively move onwards. In Anglo-Saxon England in the 7th and 8th centuries, we have the use of the term wishing, which is a little bit tricky, and I confess I had a hard time trying to understand this one. In certain instances, it is in reference to a particular Germanic tribe, probably in reference to a locality or as the encampment or city or maybe even fortified settlement of a very specific Germanic tribe. But in the great majority of the written sources, it is in reference to a pirate, more specifically a sea robber, and this is precisely the term that is also used by the Anglo-Saxons when referring to Northmen in general. So it becomes somewhat perceptible that this is a derogatory term in reference to Northmen. If this is the origins of the Old Norse term Víkingr, it did not appear in Old Norse vocabulary before at least the early 9th century, and it was a term borrowed from Anglo-Saxon. Adam of Bramham in the 11th century, like other authors of this period of this time, referred to certain peoples from the north who sailed, pirated, and caused a lot of disturbance on the coasts of England and other coastal areas, were designated as Ascomani, somewhere between the lines of wooden man, boatman, or even ash man. Ascomani here in the sense that perhaps boats were made of ash wood, and these specific boats and the boatmen spread terror in the northern seas. He specifically says that these Ascomani, the ones he so calls Ascomani, are designated by other, are called or labeled by other Northern European peoples as Viking, which is the Anglo-Saxon term for piratai, pirates, as Adam of Bremen puts it, which I assume is ecclesiastical medieval Germanic Latin, so please correct me if I'm wrong, probably derived from classical Latin predo, adjective piraticos or predatorios, pirate, and in the sense of predator. Be that as it may, here it is reinforced that some who sail and use ash boats, plundered, pillaging and pirating were nicknamed Viking, pirates. If we really focus on the sources of the time in search of the term and a designation for it, the term Víkingr appears in the sources of the 12th and 13th centuries, which associates Víkingr with a type of occupation. Here very much implied a type of profession. So we are already talking about sources written in a period already after the end of the so-called Viking Age and in a medieval Nordic context. It is very likely that this term is derived from vik, which in turn means inlet, bay or harbor or port, to make port, as already mentioned before. Thus, a Víkingr is one who frequents the harbors or does some sort of activity in bays, someone who sails or someone who is closely linked to the sea and maritime activities. Perhaps a more generalized translation is he or the person who makes port or harbor, or the person who sails, or someone who practices sailing expeditions or doing navigation. Navigation here applied to a whole set of activities related to the act of waterfaring, whether for trade or trading, exploration, colonization, or even looting and pillaging and piracy. So here lies the big problem in the ancient texts, which is the use of the term pirate, Viking or Víkingr, in a generalized way. When using the term Víkingr as an occupation, we are dealing with a term that has also been applied to populations that are ethnically non-Scandinavian, with diverse beliefs and social structures. It seems that the term was used to designate anyone who was a pirate, not only in reference to people from Scandinavia, but also from the British Isles, the Baltic, the Netherlands, the Low Countries, and a whole set of peoples who were dedicated to piracy. But then, in later periods, in the 12th and the 13th centuries, the term continued to be used, but already covering other maritime activities, precisely at a time when maritime traffic throughout Europe began to be more frequent and more common. So in the medieval period, it already became a broader term used to designate other seafaring activities from the part of various peoples. Perhaps a good example of what I said at the beginning of this video, that not every Scandinavian was a Viking, is precisely the source Heimskringla by Snorre Sturluson, 13th century, which reinforces the idea that a Viking was a matter of occupation or activity. In Håkon the Good's saga, it tells us precisely about Håkon, King Håkon, having defeated 11 Viking ships. Apparently, these Vikings were West Slavs. Håkon takes upon himself to kill both Danish and Slavic Vikings for as long as he reigns. So here we have Håkon I of Norway, 10th century, a Scandinavian who doesn't identify himself as a Viking, nor his men are Vikings, and is willing to destroy Slavic Vikings and other Scandinavian Vikings, namely the Danes. Also, in King Olaf Tryggvason's saga, it is described how Olaf himself was captured by non-Scandinavian Baltic Vikings. In Egil's saga, we have the account of Egil Skallagrimsson's expedition to Kurland, Latvia, where the Vikings of those lands end up capturing him and also capturing Danes who were also on Viking expeditions. This is a good source, also a good source, not only for us to understand that not all Vikings were Scandinavians and that some Vikings fought against Scandinavian Vikings and Vikings from other lands, but also that Vikings fought each other, as being a Viking was an occupation with links to maritime activities. So Viking pirates could attack Viking merchants and Vikings on expeditions. In this sense, being a Viking was to engage in maritime activities. To finalize this video, let's focus on archaeological sources and what they can tell us about the use of and meaning of the term Víkingr. One of the first rune stones I have studied to be able to make this video was the Tirste runestone Lolland in Denmark, dating from the late 10th century, early 11th century. It was a puzzle because I didn't want to use the sources to help me decipher the runic text. It was a bit of a challenge. I didn't make the same mistake with the other examples that I'm going to show you in a moment. In any case, the text of this example tells us of someone who went on an expedition and died in Sweden. And at the end of the inscription we have Allir Vikingr, all Vikings. Here, in this context, the word is not synonymous with Scandinavian. It is not applied in a way to express ethnicity or even in a sense of nation or country, but rather in the sense of referring to those who go Viking, explore, set sail in a maritime activity which makes people belong to an occupation or to a group which engages in this activity of going Viking. We clearly understand that this activity, at least for the people who have raised this runestone in memory of their compatriot, took this activity seriously, and this was their main occupation: to set sail, to go Viking, to explore or going on a maritime expedition. There are other examples, of course. However, I must say that the occurrences of the term in runestones, Víkingr, was not very common. If I'm not mistaken, the number of runic inscriptions has already been updated, which is a total of 6,587 runic inscriptions. And apart from the one I have already mentioned from Denmark, only 6 Swedish runic stones contain references to the term Vikingr, one of which is from Jutland. So only a total of 7 rune stones referring to the term Viking or Vikingr, 6 of which in Sweden. There are, however, 18 inscriptions that contain Vikingr or some variant of the term, but used as a proper or personal name, so literally as personal names. So it doesn't matter for the case we are dealing with here, because those are in reference to people who were not Vikings, but their name was Viking or some variant of the name. So really a total of 7 inscriptions, and all of them refer to an activity going on expeditions, be those exploration, trading or raiding, but clearly maritime expeditions. In fact, 3 of these runestones bear the inscription He Víkingr, literally in Viking, to do something in the activity of Viking. Could be in Viking voyages, expeditions, raids, etc. Here the meaning is to express the method of activity. So here a Viking raid is in the sense of being a raid made by navigation, or Viking expedition is in the sense of being an expedition by sea or by water in general, the act of navigation. They are not voyages, neither expeditions nor raids nor trade by land, but by means of Viking, by the navigation method, to go on Viking or do it through Viking. The remaining examples have it well present the idea that the participants of these expeditions were called Vikings, or the expedition itself was called Viking. So they weren't Vikings outside of these activities. They were just called Vikings at the time of the activity and while doing it. Once again, this reinforces the idea of occupation or participation, engaging on the activity of Viking, and not a term in reference to an ethnic group or a population or people, but rather a group participating on an activity with maritime characteristics. It is not related to an ethnic or national identity, but to an identity of occupation, doing an activity and participating in it. Alright, my dear friends, that's that, and I hope you have enjoyed this video and that it may prove to have been useful. Thank you so much for watching, see you on the next video, and as always, tack för idag. Thanks for today. Obrigado por hoje. Farewell.